Okay, so in this webinar on peaking, I'm going to talk about peaking for its success and bodybuilding shows, okay? And the brief is what is peaking, different strategies that people utilize, what is the science, what can potentially go wrong, and then have you tried peaking? So if I asked you to define peaking, our man Steve, what would you say peaking is from the bodybuilding context, or even just a sports context? How would you describe it?
Reaching the ultimate condition and timing it correctly.
Okay, I think that's good. Yeah, reaching the ultimate condition, timing it correctly. Anything else after that, Arman? I think that's pretty good.
Yep, exactly. I think I have nothing to add. It's exactly how it was
Okay.
described.
So
Sounds easy on paper, doesn't it?
yeah, no, that's good. Okay, this is a definition that I came up with, and because I'm a scientist, it's much more wordy than that. But I've gone with the goal of creating a physical appearance of yourself that is more competitive than if there were to be no modification to your regularly dietary regime or training. Yeah. So trying to outdo your regular look through manipulation of those factors. Yeah. And I think that sits in with what you're sort of talking about there, Steve. And already that brings to mind sort of different aspects of some people peak, some people don't. It is about physical appearance, and there is a manipulation of nutrition and training as part of it. Yeah. Now, peaking can take many different forms. Steve, you've been around for just as long as I have in this, and people do all different types of strategies. They can be, I've heard 2-week peaking strategies. I've heard 1-day strategies, and I've heard 1-day, on the day rather, strategies as well. I've heard people tell me that they don't peak, and then I've heard them tell me that actually they change their food the day before and then, or they change their food completely on the day. So in that respect, if we look at our original definition, they are peaking because they're doing something to modify their look to get the best physique they possibly can. Yeah. So peaking takes many different shapes and forms, and it usually involves multiple variables. So we were talking about water manipulation, macronutrients, and that also includes alcohol, because some people like to manipulate themselves with that. Micronutrients, so sodium is the number one thing that people manipulate, but a lot of people don't think about potassium as well, because a lot of people consume high potassium foods. There's manipulation of your training, so people change the amount of resistance training they're doing, they change the amount of cardiovascular training they're doing, and then they change the amount of posing that they might be potentially doing as well. But the other thing on top of that that's not mentioned here is rest, yeah, because people change that as well. And then in the non-tested side of the world, people also do things like polypharmacy, right? So they manipulate the types of drugs that they're using to achieve a different look as well, yeah. And we're not talking about that today because we're talking about natural bodybuilding. Okay, so these are your priorities when it comes to creating the ultimate look. This is what you're trying to achieve, right? And when you look at it like this, perhaps you're not thinking to yourself, there's quite a lot going on there, actually, yeah? Because you've got, if you count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, potentially 9 different variables. So there's lots of different plates that the athlete is spinning to try and achieve the best look, which is no surprise that people often make mistakes because they've only got certain elements of the puzzle in place when it comes to trying to make themselves look the best. So they make mistakes, yeah? But ultimately, what we're trying to do with that peaking process, whether it's 2 weeks before or on the day, is to have the lowest body fat levels possible for competition. So that might mean that you ramp the cardio up really, really high to try and get extra expenditure to reduce the body fat in preparation. But at the same time, you typically reduce your carbohydrate intake potentially very low to try and create a bigger deficit. You're trying to get a dry look, yeah? So you're trying to reduce what we call subcutaneous water, right? So you manipulate your water to try and do something with that, but you also manipulate sodium and potassium at the same time. We're trying to maximize muscle fullness, right? So we want our muscles to be as large as they possibly can. So we want them big and full, like they're full up like balloons. And the way in which we do that is we add water in there, we put glycogen into them at the same time, and we put a little bit of sodium. So we're going to try and do that at the same time. So already when you're considering just those three variables that I've mentioned already, you can see how some other strategies, when you think about what bodybuilders do in the back of their mind, might not be as helpful. So things like fat loading, for example, doesn't necessarily achieve that maximum muscle fullness look if the goal is to fill them up with carbohydrates, and that's how muscles get full. However, there are strategies like fat loading that you could talk about. And we definitely want to minimize stomach bloating, right? Absolutely 100% we want to make sure that we do that. You see guys going on stage and they're bloated. That was a criticism for a long time of IFBB competitors. Yeah, the waists are not streamlined. So it's not a good look on stage. So we have to manage the amount of food that we're eating and make sure we get it in the appropriate way. We want to minimize fatigue. So we see this a lot in bodybuilding contests. There's always one or two physiques in this contest that have been pushed to the extreme. They've gone past the point of being shredded and looking healthy, and now they just look a little bit tired and unhealthy. And people have got healthy physiques and healthy looking physiques and fresh looking physiques. They just pop and typically look better. And some of that is to do with the things that we're mentioning above, right? Yeah. Often not thought about, but worth considering. We want to make sure that the athlete can actually perform when they go on stage, right? So if you're dehydrated or if you don't have any energy in the system, just like when you go and play sports or when you train in the gym, you might struggle to actually be able to perform, right? So worth bearing in mind. The other thing we've got to think about is contests often have different sections. So you might be competing in the morning and then the evening, or you might be competing in multiple classes, or you might end up in an overall, right? So we've got to think about, well, how do we manage the physique over the course of the day? And then the last things that I've got written down here are stress, right? And you can probably relate some of that to a placebo as well. So we want to make sure that the plan that you put together doesn't stress somebody out. Yeah. We also want to make sure that we put together sometimes a plan for them or make some modification because people want a plan. There's a bit of a placebo there, but they might get stressed by not having a plan. So sometimes there's a little bit of what we might call gamesmanship being played in here. So you're playing a little bit of psychology. So the big question is, based on all that sort of stuff, and stop me if I'm going too fast, what is it that people do then? So what sort of strategies have I just thrown out to you, have you come across in the past?
Tried them all.
Okay, go for some, Steve.
So I at the moment, and for the last couple of years, I don't carb deplete. My diet stays the same day in, day out.
Yeah.
And I do that for 11, 12 months when I'm prepping. I increase my output as we get close to the shows. So I've just done cardio. I've been sat down on my bum all day in Manchester, so I've just got back. So I've just done cardio to compete. I've got British Championships starting in 6 weeks. I don't suffer from stomach bloating, quite unusual. I was knackered last week, so I didn't back off. I just had a couple of days off work. But I'm still on 3,400 calories every day, and I'm still coming down very, very gradually. And I don't aim to peak for. I've got 4 British Championships, so I don't aim to peak for any single one of them. I just hope to improve as I go through them all. But I think I do most of these in certain bits. So I do have a plan. Tell people I don't diet, which I actually do. You know, it's because I don't perceive my diet as being a diet. It's consistent. All I do is increase my output. So even off season, I've got the same amount of calories going in. But yeah, I've always got enough energy when I get on stage. They seldom feel tired when I get up there. And I don't worry particularly about when you go a morning show and an evening show either. I'll just carry on eating my normal foods that I would normally eat during the day.
I mean, you've got a plan. That's the main thing, though,
Yes,
haven't you?
yeah,
That's the thing. And if I'm looking at it as an outsider, and you're saying if you've got 4 consecutive shows, then theoretically, if you're increasing your output, although you're not trying to peak for some of them, by the time you get to the last one, that is possibly going to be, because of the output that you've put in, the best look, or the quote unquote peak look. Sometimes, because I'm conscious that when you do consecutive shows, very often we have that attitude, which is we'll look better by the fourth one on the fourth week. That often the look you have in the first show isn't too different from the one in the final show, because things change in that week. But it sounds like you manage the stress. That's the other thing, by taking time off work. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aiming for the second British Championship. Is actually the one I want to win, so that's what I'm aiming for. But you're right. I look better at the Aberdeen Classic, or we only call it Granite City Classic. I look better there than I have done in the other shows further down the line.
I wonder if some of that's rest, and this sort of idea of the minimizing fatigue, because if you spend more time on the diet, I don't know.
I think I backed off after. So Granite City Classic to the next one was about 10 weeks, so I backed off. Put maybe, because on water weight, I put probably 3-4 kilograms back on from the day of the show, and then I struggled to come back down again. So I wasn't that worried about the rest of the shows.
All right, okay, fair enough. So I'm reaching there. So in terms of strategies, though, right? This is a paper that I published a few years ago. This is what bodybuilders do to get ready for competitions, right? This is the demographic. So I think there's 86 competitors here. You can add them up, or is it 81 competitors? This is the average age of them, the average years that they've been training. You can see the start weight when they start their competition diets: 88 for the males, 63 for the females. Ended in their diets 76, and then 55. So there's some averages, and then some percentage weight loss. It's around about 13%, and that's where that classic expression of maybe staying around about 15% body fat maximum off season probably comes from, because this is what people do on average, right? It's what they do on average. So go any more than that, and it probably starts to get a little bit difficult. But this is what people do when you ask them and you break it down, right? So people do lots of different things, right? And these are the percentages, because I've just asked them the question, what strategy do you use to get in shape, right? And the idea is, well, if lots of people are utilizing a strategy, then there might be something in that strategy. There's some value to that. That's why people persist with it. And so this is what people potentially do. So you can see in terms of strategies, carbohydrates, water, sodium manipulation, use of vitamin C, and regular diets. These are the most common practices that people utilize to get in shape for the shows. Now, the proportions are not all equal, and if you scan across, you can see these things, but I've pointed out a few things here on you. By far and away, the most popular strategies are carbohydrate loading. So lots and lots of people put carbohydrates in. They increase the carbohydrate intake in the days going up to the show. That's really, really common, yeah? At the same time, if you have a look, carbohydrate restriction is really popular as well. So lots of people do that as well. And then if you look across, you can see that actually around about 50% of males and a lot of females are practicing both of them. Yeah, so doing that classical deplete carbohydrates and then load carbohydrates, right? So that's very, very common amongst bodybuilders. The big question for me that I've always got is, do you need to actually restrict the carbohydrate? Can you just load and get the same effect? Now, in terms of water, the next most popular strategy, water loading is also very popular as well. And I'll come on and I'll talk about that later on, yeah? Water restriction is popular, but not as probably popular as it used to be, Steve, is it? I mean, not a lot of people restrict it quite like
that. I still do it. I don't do water load. I just don't find it works for me. I have my normal water. I have my normal carbohydrates, unless I'm desperate. But I don't tend to be desperate, and I do. I do carb load the day before, but
Yeah, so
not
you do a little bit. I'm going to
not
show you something
excessively.
that you'll find interesting, though. I'm absolutely positive you'll find it interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, sodium. Some people sodium load, some people sodium restrict. Very few people do load. That's the next popular one. Vitamin C is a classic. That's a diuretic trick to try and push out the water. That's popular. About a quarter of people do that in these studies. Regular dieters, they're in the minority. It's about 10% amongst the men. Female competitors not doing it, but there's a lot of people that are just following a regular diet like you're doing, Steve.
Yeah.
Maybe they are doing a little bit more carbohydrate, but you can have a little read of some of the strategies. So these are quotes from people that filled out the questionnaires for us, and they said, like, at the start of the week, I switched back to low carbs until 3 days out. Deplete 3 days before, so 100 grams, 75, 60 grams. 4-day carb deplete, then 3 days carb loading. So very common strategies that you're come across. And in terms of loading strategies, you can see you've got one person here saying 1,100 grams, then 600 and 400, and then 700 on a day. 2,500 split across 3 days, 1,200, etc. From there. Yeah, so you see lots of that sort of stuff. And then the water loading, you can see here people saying, well, I increase it along with vitamin C, going up to 12 liters, 8 liters, etc. So these are what people are doing to get ready for competition in terms of different strategies. In terms of competition day, it's perhaps less complicated. And this is what people typically do. So high carbohydrate, high GI pre-stage. That's the most popular strategy, again, you can see, yeah? So people are wanting more carbohydrates to fill up the muscles. Yeah, as continuation of that carb load strategy. Higher carbohydrates again on the day as a whole. Yeah. So people are, oh, sorry, I made a mistake here. I should say, so a lot of people are taking things like honey and wine gums and sweeties and things like this just before they go on stage. Yeah. And then in general, it's a slightly higher carbohydrate day than they otherwise would normally have. Yeah. If you look across, you can see alcohol still really popular. So almost 30% of females. Maybe it's for Dutch courage. Maybe it's a diuretic effect. Now, I think physiologically, it's probably the Dutch courage rather than the diuretic effect. To be honest, and I see you nodding your head, you're probably in agreement, Steve.
Yeah.
And then water restriction again on the day, still really popular. And down here, you can see these are the common things that people like to eat across the day. Back in the day, I think I would have been really more militant and saying about what you absolutely have to eat, and you can only eat these things. But I think, I mean, I've changed over the years, and there's probably a lot of things that you can rather consume on the day as long as they work for you and they're not going to bloat you, etc. From there. Yeah. I don't have any particular strong views on which type of alcohol is best to drink before you go on stage. Probably not a flaming sambuca though.
Can I
Okay.
ask a personal
Sure you can,
question?
Armin. Go for it.
In my competition, I mean, I have done only one, but I took with me, it's a food called Zephyr. It's basically egg whites and sugar. That's it. They just mix
Yep.
it. It's puffy. Is that like a good choice of a thing to?
That sounds like a bit like a meringue. Is that right? Is that what a meringue is, Steve? It's like
Sounds
egg.
like, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like
It's basically like a cupcake topping, but instead of it being soft, it's very dry because it's just egg whites and sugar.
Yeah, it's
yeah,
meringue.
that sounds exactly like a meringue,
Sure.
doesn't it? Yeah, we get them in the UK. So what that is, right? And I was going to explain this later, but I can talk a bit about this just now. So you've got to sort of think back to the context of what it is the goal of the contest prep is and how that strategy fits in with what you're trying to do on the day. So something like that will probably keep your stomach nice and flat. It potentially will increase your muscle fullness. And because it's high in protein, it potentially makes you look dry as well. But at the same time, if that's all you're eating all day, if you were just to eat that in the context of a normal day, you can imagine you probably wouldn't feel that great, would you? You'd probably feel a bit sluggish from doing that sort of thing. There probably wouldn't be enough energy beyond that in there as well, because there's not any fats in there, there's not any starchy carbohydrates, and you might get a bit of a sugar crash. The other thing we know, Armin, is that protein tends to slow down digestion. So although you've got something which is highly processed, you can maybe potentially, if you're trying to eat something like that as a pre-stage sugar thing, pick a better thing which doesn't have the protein in it. So just something which has got a much higher carbohydrate content. So I know I was saying that I'm not that militant about what you eat on a day, but you probably are, if you want to get the maximum sugar rush, better off having like jelly babies and things like grapes and so on, or jam, rather than like sweets that have got like gelatin in them because of that protein content, if you see what I mean, because you potentially slow it down. Now, how much does a difference does it really going to make? Have you measured people's blood glucose, and that's how quickly does that sugar appear in the bloodstream? Maybe like 2 or 3 minutes later. And it might not actually matter, right? But if you want to optimize everything, then maybe slightly better strategy could be utilized. But I assume you weren't just eating that on the day. But you're going to probably tell me you were.
Sadly, I was. Yes, that was
Right,
my
yeah.
only.
So
Yeah.
now that I've explained those things to you, you're thinking, right, actually.
I
But
mean, at that point, I was just so into like, I was like, no matter what happens, I'm just gonna trust the coach that
yeah,
just said everything. I can't go like to switch up on the very last minute saying like, okay, I'm lacking in this and this because I don't have any experience. So I'll just go
yeah.
based off of what he says and I'll just do whatever it is. No matter if it's bad or good, it's just who I chose and my
Yeah.
mistake at the end,
Well,
regardless.
it's a lot of this stuff is common sense, right? But the thing about common sense is common sense doesn't seem to be common knowledge. Because, like as I said to you, if you just ate all those meringues or your foods, egg
Uh,
white and
tech
sugar,
Technically, I had it with me. My water was almost done, and I was only allowed to have a little sip of water just to make
yeah,
my mouth not to like dry. And I had a little, I think about like 8 of them. They're just this
yeah,
sizes. And I was like, okay, I'll go first. I'll go for my first show. I'll come down the stage. I'll have another two because I had like 5 minute break until the next one because they were in a row. The junior and the bantamweight went in a row together. So that's what happened. So I just went down the stage. I had another two, had just a little bit of water in me, and I just went back up the stage again.
Well, look, I mean, as I said, there's maybe slightly better things you could have, but if that's what
Yeah.
you've got, it's better
Yeah.
not having that. But I guess what I was going to say was that if you just think in the context of a normal day, would you eat that sort of thing? And how you might
Absolutely.
feel just eating
Absolutely
that
not.
sort
That
of
was
thing?
I think the second time. I just had it once to know what it tastes like. And that was
Yeah,
it. I never had it again in my entire life
yeah.
until the competition day.
Exactly. And if I were to say to you, right, okay, to perform as an athlete, what I need you to do is just eat these things on a regular day and go to the gym and do a workout, you'd be like, surely I should be eating more things than that, right? But
Exactly.
you just trust the process.
Yeah.
A lot of this stuff, it's a case of actually thinking about it. Like, well, what's the actual context of the goal here and what I'm trying to achieve? And does it make sense in that kind of context? Okay, here's some more comp prep quotes from there. Anyway, so this is what it looks like in practice when you put it all together, right? So when you put all the quotes in, right? And I'll walk you through it, right? So what we've got here on this axis here, we've got the carbohydrate intake. Yeah, and these are the bars here, right? So what you can see is you've got day 1, day 2, day 3 out from the contest, day 4, day 5, day 6, and then you've got the contest day, right? So people, typically what they're doing is they're carbohydrate depleting, and then they're carbohydrate loading on what you call, this is a front load, you call this. Some people back load. Front load's probably safer because if things go wrong when you backload it and put the carbohydrates that way, there's less room for maneuvering, yeah? Because if you do it this way, if it goes wrong on this day, then at least you've got that day there, that day there, and that day there to work it out, right? So that's what we're doing with the carbohydrates, right? And then the carbohydrate intake might be slightly higher. The other context I should have here is maybe the regular carbohydrate intake over here, which you can see this is maybe still slightly higher than. Okay, the other thing is the water. So water intake kind of regular, increase to go along with the carbohydrate, and then decreases the carbohydrate, and then slightly lower than regular. And sometimes not drinking on a day itself. Yeah, so that's what all these quotes and when you add it all up, what it kind of looks like overall. And when you think about a plan like this, you could work a plan out like this. Yeah, you could do it now. Now you see it. Now, the origins of this sort of stuff are really, they come from endurance sport. This is where it first kind of comes from, because people have been doing carb loading techniques in endurance sports for years. Okay, and the goal is that because you're running over a distance, you actually only have so much carbohydrate in your muscle to last a certain amount of distance. So you have to take on board, when you're cycling, running, swimming, rowing, whatever it is that you're doing, more carbohydrate with you. So you have to keep taking gels and so on, particularly if you're exercising over 2 hours, or you just run out of carbohydrate. Yeah. So carb loading is a strategy to top up your carbohydrate stores even higher than they normally would be to enhance your performance, right? And it does have a performance enhancing effect, right? So we know that it increases performance by around about 2 or 3%. So it actually does work, which is amazing, right? It really, really does work. But of course, these guys, they don't care about how they look, right? They care about winning the race. Now, with that in mind, there's different carbohydrate loading strategies that people have suggested from the endurance world. So you could potentially offload them into the bodybuilding world. So the strategy that I just showed you there with the graphics, yeah, that's this one here, right? So what you've got is you've got day one all the way through to here, and then you've got the competition, right? You've got your 3 days of low carbohydrate dieting, 3 days of high carbohydrate dieting, and then you've got the competition where you're maybe having your regular intake or slightly higher carbs or your carbohydrates before you go on stage, yeah? You've also got your training. So you've had this long program that you've been following for the weeks ahead, but then after that, we're doing some exhaustive training to try and deplete your muscles even more of the glycogen, to try and get the glycogen levels as low as you possibly can. Usually it's a high set regime. And then there's no training after that to let the muscles recover. Because if you're trying to fill your car up with a tank of gas, you don't want to be driving it at the same time because you're just going to empty it again, right? So you rest and then you do your competition, yeah? So that's a classical example, right? But in endurance training, people now do this. They do this modified loading strategy whereby they do their endurance exercise, they taper back their training, they have their normal carbohydrate intake, and then they just go all high carb. Yeah. And then have the contests. So for someone like yourself, Steve, you could potentially look at doing something like that.
It looks a little bit like my style of doing it, but I'd probably stick normal carbs all the way through. And to be honest, I'm a bugger for training. I trained legs a couple of days before the Aberdeen Granite City Classic, which is ridiculous, which you completely forgot.
You forgot the contest.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what?
Forget doing it.
There's certain, I mean, one of the big things in training science at the moment is reps and reserve and doing what they call no junk volume and optimal amounts of sets. And I think there's probably an argument for training the muscle but not fatiguing it in this peaking process, which makes sense. And I might talk about this if I've got the time to do it. So that's a different strategy. You've got the 1 day short peak, yeah? So normal carbohydrates, low carbohydrates, then a couple of high days before again. So it's like a combination of the two. But the day before, what you do is you really chuck all the carbs in. You do some training at the same time. And the idea is, and it fits in with the context of what you're saying there, is maybe what you do is you go low carbohydrates, then you throw carbohydrates in there. And then the muscles get used to being loaded up on carbohydrates, so they don't take any more. So you do an hour hard training session or some sort of training session to make them more responsive again. And then you can throw in even more carbohydrates, if that makes sense. Yeah? So you're trying to maximize. Now, that would be much more risky. But there's a bit of what you were just talking about there, Steve, for sure, with that strategy.
The only thing I'd be questioning on that one is, what would my insides feel like after having stuffing a load of carbs in before a competition?
Yes.
Struggle on the day.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. And I think you've made a great point there. And it's that thing again about what is the goal? What is it that we're actually trying to achieve with this? And when you go back to this look, it's like, well, sure, you'll get muscle fullness, but if you're bloated, that can ruin your look. Because bloating is not only about having abs which look great, but its stomach's distended. Typically, bloating also means you look watery in the midsection as well.
Yeah.
I ate too many carbs when I did the Navi Universe. I remember the last time I competed on the day of the contest. I was just eating rice cakes. I just kept doing it. And I should have stopped. And I would have had a better, tighter midsection. I don't think it would have helped me win, but I would have been tighter. Okay, so those are different strategies, right? And this is what's happening with the depletions and the loadings, right? It causes something in the muscle called muscle glycogen supercompensation. And it really does work, right? Really does work, right? So it just upregulates your receptors in your muscles, GLUT4 receptors, we call them. It also upregulates something called hexokinase, which is a glycogen storing enzyme, and it makes you far more sensitive. And as a result, you can store about 20 to 25% more glycogen. So you can actually get more muscle glycogen into the muscles and have an effect. And in terms of endurance training, 2 to 3%, right? The recommendations are, though, it's high, 10 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight, right? So a lot of people, when they load, they don't load on that much. They do things like, I'm going to have 500 grams of carbs or 600 grams of carbs. It's like, well, you're not touching the sides to really fill the fuel tank. And then when you consider in the context of, if you take a regular 3,500 calorie diet or something, Steve, and then you just up it by a couple of 100 grams of carbs, yeah, then really all you're doing is
daily food.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the point. You've got enough carbs and enough energy just for your daily food, and you're not really eating much more on top of that.
Yeah.
That's where I think a lot of people really go wrong with this, is they just don't eat enough. They don't get it, and they're scared to eat more than they actually otherwise need to. And if you're doing strategies like carbohydrate backloading rather than front loading, then you can see how you'd be even more scared to think, right, I'm going to go 500 on the first day, 700 on the second day. I wouldn't want to be doing 1,000 grams of carbs by the third day, the day before the contest, because in my experience, working with all my athletes, when I always backload them, or rather, sorry, front load them and put all the big carbs in the first day, the second day, they don't look great.
Yeah.
It's usually the third day that they start to look good and where they need to look. Yeah. And then after that, if they can maintain that look and not get stressed by traveling, etc., because that's often the thing that does people in, then you might be on a winner for the strategy being successful. So I think if you're going to speak to people, Steve, and you want a number one takeaway point from this whole webinar, it's maybe that one. It's a lot of people just don't eat enough to even get close to filling up those carbohydrate fuel reserves, because all the carbs they're eating, it just goes to their daily food. Just goes to their daily energy. Okay, and that's what this slide here talks about here, right? So if you do the math, right, guy your size, Steve, could probably store somewhere in the region of 550 to 600 grams of carbs. Now, your stores are not going to be full like that all the time because you're in a deficit, right?
Yeah.
But that means that your capacity is actually around about 660 to 750 grams with a super compensation, yeah? So you can see how, right, okay, well, I need to probably eat about 700 grams on a day, for a day, rather, and get those levels, those stores full. And then I need to make sure that I'm eating enough to keep them full thereafter. So if you're going to drop things back like fats, you're going to drop things back like protein, which is an energy source as well, potentially, then the carbs are going to have to be high, right?
I could have 9 breakfasts.
What was that, sorry?
I could have 9 breakfasts.
Yeah.
I like 80 grams of porridge oats for breakfast.
Yeah. Well, the other concept of this as well, I'm not mentioning, is fiber. Yeah. So food choices probably matter, right? Because if you're going to eat 8 breakfasts and there's around about 6 to 12 grams of fiber per 100 grams of oats, you can see that you eat 50, 80, 70 grams of fiber, right? So you're just going to shit a lot.
Exactly.
Right? But the other thing to remember is as well, if you're going to eat things like your regular diet, which is maybe fibrous, you might have a lot of fiber in it, then at the same time, maybe that's going to potentially bloat you. So you maybe want to reduce the fiber to compensate and maybe eat a little bit more carbs, but you should always practice this as well. But maybe then you get bagged up. Yeah. So this is why another key thing that I would always mention with this stuff is
Keep your
if
watch.
you can, a couple of weeks before a contest, practice it and see. Because I'm giving you the science here about what can happen here and there and what you need to consider. But I mean, you see how it really works in practice because it's going to potentially work a little bit different. The other thing is, of course, glycogen is stored with water. So that's why you see those graphics that I showed you earlier on. If you're going to eat more carbs, you need to have more water to go along with those carbs, right? Maybe not as much. I mean, when I was younger, people were consuming 14 mils per gram of carbohydrate, right? I don't know where that figure actually came from, but I've looked ever since and I've found figures like 3 mils, right? So I used to have, when I was working with Vicky and Guy and stuff like 15 litres of water, insane amounts. And then I started to question it and say, well, could I just drink 10? And I looked just as good, right? And then a few years later, I was like, right, now I'm just drinking 8 or 9. And actually, it works just the same, right? So, yeah, you don't need to drink crazy amounts, but you probably need to keep drinking and you drink more, right? Carbohydrates are transported across your cell membranes in your intestinal tract using 2 methods. You've got GLUT2, and you've also got something called SGT1, which is sodium and glutamine, sodium glucose transporter 1, right? So you need sodium to transport that glucose. So you need, if you're going to have extra carbs, you need extra water, you need extra sodium. So if you're eating more, you don't cut the sodium out. The sodium's got to stay in there. And that's another sort of strategy that I've learned down the years, yeah, is to keep the sodium in. Okay, does it work? Well, this is
Bob.
no, it looks like Bob actually, yeah.
It
But this
does
is
look like Bob.
Christopher Barakat. He's a double, right?
Yeah.
It really is. He's got the same abs as well. Actually, Bob's got better abs. So this is a study which Christopher Barakat actually did on himself, right? And this is his strategy for carbohydrate loading, and they wrote it up as a scientific paper. And you can see a lot of the elements that I mentioned, right? So if I just pick a few out, you've got days out from the contest. So one day, this is the day before. You've got the fat intake down here. You've got the carbohydrate intake, protein intake. But I've highlighted days 6, 5, and 4 because I think they're the most interesting, and days 3 and 2, right? And everything's kind of samey. But if you go along, you can see, okay, water's the same up until 3 days out, where he suddenly goes from about 7 litres up to around about 11 litres. Yeah. So he goes regular intake, then a few days before drinks more. Then a day before, he goes back to the regular intake, right? Sodium's the same up until 2 days before, where he drinks more. Carbohydrates, actually regular, goes low and then puts them up higher again, along with the sodium in the water. So that's in tandem, drops the fat back, yeah, and keeps protein the same, right? So that's what he's kind of doing there. I mean, any thoughts on that?
I tell you what, 6, 5, and 4, I'd still be training on those days. I couldn't survive on those low carbs.
Yeah.
I get jitters when I go out for a walk. Never mind trying to train on that.
Well, that'll be his carb depletion sort of strategy that he's using there, and he might have increased at the same time the cardio. But when I look at this, right, what I'm seeing is too few carbs because he's got more calories, but how much more calories has he actually got? Because he's cut back the fat
It's not a
to
lot.
compensate. He'd be better off just keeping his fat probably regular to what it was, or a little bit higher, to get to that position that I was talking about before, because there's no way he's topping up his stores to the levels that I've just talked about for a 25 to 30% potential increase. So that was my immediate thought when I looked at it. I thought, all right, it's not actually that high when you look at it, but it's a strategy nonetheless. And this is a case study. And the reason I included that is because it's interesting. There's more interesting data, right? So what they've done is they've measured muscle thickness, and then this is carbohydrate intake, and this is muscle thickness using an ultrasound. So to scan the muscle, right? And what you can see is over here, this is where the carbohydrate intake goes down. Yeah. Carbohydrate goes up. Yep. And then it goes back to the regular amount, right? And you can see muscle thickness fairly consistent, but then leaps really up to that day before the contest, and more like 2 days before the contest. And remember, that's where you have these carbohydrates.
Yeah.
The highest, and the water the highest, and the sodium the highest. And then it kind of comes down and goes up, right? So the question I'd kind of thinking immediately with this is, has he missed the peak? Was the day to do it here, not here, or here for the comp day, right? So just the immediate thought that comes to me. This is an ultrasound scan, right? This is subcutaneous layer. Yeah, so that layer of fat underneath the tricep. This is at the start of the week, right? 3 days out from the contest here. And then this one here is, this is the competition morning, right? So comp prep day. And actually, in terms of subcutaneous layer, it is smaller. So you can see the numbers. You've got 50 centimeters, or sort of half a centimeter versus 30 millimeters. So it's 0.2 of a drop, right? So it's decent. And then down here, what you've got is, this is the sum of subcutaneous thickness, right? For the skin folds. So you can see here, it's the thickness, some of them 30 millimeters, and then it goes up and it comes all the way down for the contest. So you should have a fuller muscle without having any more thickness in there. So he's managed to put all the water essentially into the muscle and the glycogen into the muscle, yeah? As it seems to be what's actually happening. So it's interesting, right?
Just sparking my conscience as well by, I've always put udos in when I'm on prep. I haven't done it this year. And I wonder if that's having an impact on the way I'm looking.
Well, you might be you're coming out of a shortfall, because udos, a tablespoon of that might be worth 10 mil. That's 90 calories.
And I do that morning and night. And with Crohn's, I don't absorb fat particularly well anyway.
Well, there you go, Steve. That's 200 calories, mate, nearly.
Yeah.
That you might be losing out on, that just keeps those muscles full, right? Because you've got to realize, if there's not enough energy there, the body's going to use the carbohydrate for the energy that you're trying to fill the fuel tank up with.
Exactly. Yeah.
If the energy is there in the form of the fats, the body will just use the fat, and then you can keep the fuel store large. So the fats serve the purpose of giving you energy for that day's activity, but also making sure that you don't leach the carbohydrate from the muscle that you're trying to utilize. Here's some more data on this as well. This is intracellular water and extracellular water from here. And basically what he's managed to do is he's driven, or rather, let's take a step back. He's increased his total body water content by 3.9%. So 2 liters is what it says in the paper. And he's managed to drive more water intracellularly, so into the muscle, rather than extracellularly, which would be underneath the skin. That's happened, yeah? And that's what this graphic shows. And then there's another factor here. This is interesting. When you measure his bicep in terms of circumference size, it's the same. When you ask him how he's feeling and how he's looking in terms of fullness, he's fuller, right? So what's happening is, you might not necessarily be larger, right? But what you've actually done is you've put more water and more glucose into the muscle. That's made the skin thinner, and actually the size hasn't changed overall, and you've got fuller off the back of it. So the peaking strategies that I've been talking about, they can physiologically work, and this sort of shows it does, yeah? Whether you agree with if he's putting enough carbohydrates in or not or anything, it doesn't matter. It shows it works, right? So it's interesting. Okay. A few things just to consider now, though, with all this sort of stuff. With the female athlete, right? A bit more complicated. And research on peaking in female athletes, I mean, there's nothing there, right? So we couldn't say either way, right? There's some research that sort of shows that there's no difference whatsoever in muscle and strength and endurance performance and fat oxidation, etc., in female athletes. And then there's some research that shows that there is, right? And the reality is we don't know. It's absolutely going to be worthwhile being individual specific and seeing how that person deals with it, because some people are going to react differently, just like males. How am I going to get on with adding more carbohydrate or taking away carbohydrate, or adding fats or taking away fats? And when we include the menstrual cycle and the different phases into that, and you might just have that period at the wrong time. Yeah. Now, I know some coaches recommend taking contraceptive pills and just taking them all the way through to avoid doing things like that. That has ramifications. I would never recommend that, but there's enough people doing that sort of stuff because we're not thinking about the athlete self. So also another factor we're considering. There's class consideration.
It seems to be looking more and more into that at the moment, don't they? Just for normal athletics. So
yeah,
the Olympics, they were doing more and more studies on the back of it.
Yeah, you're 100% correct. Yeah, it's a growth area in sport exercise science, and I'm doing a paper at the moment on, believe it or not, proprioception in the menstrual cycle, and are you more inclined to get injured or not? Because there's data on that. So yeah, you're 100% right. There's much more. All right, a few other things, right? It depends on what your class is as well, right? So if you need to look softer like this compared to freaky like this, then you're doing different strategies. It doesn't make sense to be like super full or super vascular or super dry, right? So there's some things you want to manipulate. So again, it's what makes sense for the look that you're trying to go for, right? Maybe you just need that fitness look and you can achieve it by not manipulating too many things. Some classes, there's ratios, and some classes you've got to make weight. So Chris's study shows that he was 2.3% heavier. It was 2 liters heavier. He's got to think about a strategy that copes with that. Is it a day before weigh-in? Is it a day of weigh-in? His strategy's got to be based around that. I've done classic class. Steve, you must have done classic class.
I have. Can't beat the weight.
Yeah, well, that's the problem, right? It's difficult. I remember when I did it last, I had to wear loads of clothes the day before, no, on the drive down for however many hours it was. I think it was like 5-6 hours with heating on, not drink any water. Like the next day weigh in, like just to eat for a day, right? And you're going to be flat.
Yeah.
And then my photos I looked flat in my photos. I could see it for that was when I did the universe in 2019. So you've got to think, right? Does it make sense to peak, right? Does it make sense to use some of these tools? Right. Here's some common mistakes now. Just not having a plan and not thinking about it logically, right? As we said with the lemon meringues, well, would you do that normally? How would you normally feel if you just ate those things? Probably not great. So can we think of a better way to do this? And how are you going to cope with it? Winging it, just doing someone else's plan, right? There's a bit of that you can kind of get away with, but you also want to know how your body reacts. And if you're someone that's got a bit of a sensitive stomach, that you know you're sensitive to holding water and stuff like that, then it makes sense to practice what you're doing, right? And that's another one. So we used to talk about warm-up shows in the past. Definitely worth sometimes doing a warm-up peak if you've never done it before. There's a lot to learn, right? This next point here is athlete knowledge, athlete skill, athlete intelligence. Without trying to be overly critical, some people have got poor food prep skills. They just do. They're not good at getting 10 containers out and put them all in a row and putting things in bags and taking things with them on the road and stuff like that. It's going to be a recipe for disaster. They've got poor food hygiene practices, so they might get an infection. They're not good at traveling. And doing all that stuff just might stress them, right? I've worked with some people in the past, lovely people, great athletes, and I've just thought to myself, do you know what? This athlete is just not going to get this. And it's going to be too stressful for them, or it's just not going to work. So you have to think about that, right? You've got to think about that. Not considering the makeup of foods, right? The junk food's the classic one, right? At least if you've always ate things like potatoes and you've measured them out and you weigh them and stuff like that, you kind of know more or less there's about 19 grams of carbohydrates in it or something like that, right? You just kind of know, right? But when it comes to things like junk food. You don't know if the Krispy Kreme donuts are the same as the ones you normally buy from Asda or whatever, right? You don't know how much fat, salt, sugar, or whatever is in those things. Right? You really are just taking a bit of a risk with that, yeah? And I showed you those slides earlier on with water content going up and down, muscle thickness changing. All that stuff can be affected by those things. I think cutting of the water, you see that with that graphic as well, how the slide shows that the muscle thickness was actually best when the water content was highest, the sodium content was highest. So you might want to make sure that you're not drinking too much on the day because you don't want to get bloated, right? You don't want a lot of stuff sloshing around that stomach. But you still probably want to drink to perform because you have to be on stage. And all athletes drink water, right? We know this. If you don't drink and you're 2 or 3% dehydrated, then what happens is you tend to see around about a 10 to 25% reduction in performance and cognitive performance as well. You make mistakes. Okay, too much fat, too much protein, right? These are the slowest absorbed nutrients. They take the longest to go through the digestive tract. We've all had big meals. We know what it's like, right? Or picking the wrong types of foods that would normally make you feel a little bit sluggish and bloated, right? Doesn't make sense to probably eat a full chili con carne and a lasagna on the day of the contest, right? Probably doesn't, right?
Yes,
There's a consideration for training. You got to think what you're doing around that. You could train on the week of. You absolutely could do it. But should you really be knocking your pan in for risking injury's sake or just being sore, right? You don't want to have sore arms and sore legs on stage because it'll affect you, right? And then this other one that I've mentioned here is just under eating as well, right? The goal is to try and fill up those fuel stars like the car, have them full, and then so you can walk on stage and keep them in there for the contest itself. Now, carbohydrates in the muscle, you don't utilize them to maintain your blood glucose levels, right? Once they're in there, right? Your body uses its liver glycogen stores, right? You have to exercise to use up the muscle glycogen stores. So that's the consideration for training. So if you can get enough calories in to the muscle, they're going to stay there, right? You still have to eat enough carbohydrates for your liver though, but that's much smaller. That reservoir is 80, 90 grams, right? It's much, much smaller. So other things, those are things which are worth considering. These are mistakes that people make. Steve, what other mistakes have you seen people make?
I think for me, it's I'm always of a mind you're either ready or you're not.
Yeah, I've got that on my slide.
Yeah, I think people underestimate the kind of condition they're in or overestimate the kind of condition they're in.
Yeah.
And then I've won all my shows this year purely on condition.
Yeah.
And people have been gobsmacked when you say, oh, how old are you? I'm 58. They don't believe the kind of condition you're in at 58. And everybody else looks fat in comparison.
You really do. You're an inspiration.
I love what she does.
I want to look like her too. What was I thinking there? I was going back through this to show something. Oh, I've forgotten it. I was going to say something to your point. This is a classic other one, the crap load. As I said, high in sodium, which is good. High in carb, which we want. There's fats there to give you energy. It might work if you're depleted, really depleted. You'd have to time it well, right? Definitely guys that use drugs are going to use diuretics. If they can get that extracellular water off them, they might be all right. But you really are gambling. It's no guarantee it's going to work, right? It's no guarantee. Okay. Yes. This was the point, right? Who shouldn't do this, right? Who are the people that you're probably thinking are not a good idea to do this, right? Anyone with a kidney issue, right? You're manipulating sodium. You're manipulating potassium. Things like potatoes, bananas, fruits, all high in potassium, right? I've not talked about water balance, but if you're putting a load of sodium in, you're also punting out a lot of potassium from your cells. And if you're eating a lot of high potassium foods, there's a balance there, right? By the same token, anyone's got high blood pressure, on blood thinners, blood issues, heart issues, definitely not.
That's me, blood thinners.
Yeah. Okay, so again,
I do diet on potatoes or bananas.
Yeah, well,
I do hold water.
High potassium foods.
And what I found,
sodium.
what I found is that I'm not wearing them now since I had a shower, but I normally wear, you know, DVT socks.
Yeah, yeah.
I have to wear DVT socks at the moment to stop the water and the edema coming through.
Just an idea. Why don't you just try putting a little bit more salt in your food all week? Just see how it works.
Yeah, I've started using pink Himalayan salt.
The pink that's got copper in it, so it's got a little bit more electrolytes in it. Yeah, but yeah, maybe you're having so much potassium
Yeah,
that
don't know.
actually a little bit more sodium might balance things out a bit. I don't know. I genuinely don't. People with GI issues.
That's always the judge's feedback. If you can match your legs to go in the same condition as your upper body, but I've never been able to do it because for whatever reason they've always been that little bit watery and a little bit lagging behind. And if I do try and get them in, I lose size up top and then I look stringy. So
Yeah, but remember, the goal of the peaking is the ultimate physique for you.
Yeah.
So the ultimate physique is the balance between those two things, right? Maybe that's what it is. And you see this with competitors. They've all got different years where that look was this and that look was that, and that was, and people say, oh, that was my best look that year. And things they were maybe slightly smaller, but more ripped, or they were slightly larger, but softer. Yeah. And I've had that thing years. I've always kind of played that game rather than just pushing the condition game.
Yeah.
GI issues are an issue, right? You know your GI tract better than anyone, Steve, so you can handle stuff, but you really have to work with someone.
Yeah, that's why I eat this stuff. It's taken me years to find out what I can eat without side effects.
So it's a gamble with what you're doing with building up.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Right, mental health issues, right? People who have got like ADHD, right? For example, they're probably going to struggle with being organized. Probably just going to struggle with that, right? They might be also taking stimulants because that's a common thing that they use, and that's just going to make them burn more calories, right? So there's a consideration there at the same time. People with eating disorders for obvious reason, and people who are taking antidepressants, that could be an issue alongside it as well. Medication in general, a lot of these things can make you hold water. A lot of these things can suppress your appetite, yeah? And then the big one that you said, Steve, is people who are not in shape in the first place, right? I mean, what's the point, right? Maybe it's placebo. Maybe we just change the food today, right? And then the other thing is you've not done it before and there's no research. That doesn't make sense either, right? Okay, so that takes me to the end of this. Just going to have a little short summary on this, but the science shows that strategies have a physiological effect. I've shown you studies on that, and I've shown you examples of what people do, right? And I've explained that people want to fill up their muscles with water, etc., and that they want to have nice, tight skin as well at the same time, right? The context is important for considering peaking. Risks happen when you do things like crap loading and so on. So you make sure you're researching, right? Practice things, for example. Not everyone should peak, but peaking is about looking the best, right? So it's the best for you. And that's going to mean a lot of different things, right? And as you explained, Steve, maybe it's not being as tight in some respects in the legs to keep the upper body, because that'll help. There's a little question on here. Let's see this. Not sure. Oh, Lewis is bringing. Oh yeah, Louise is bringing you food just now, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
It's already made. That's one good thing. I always prep all my food. It's even made for tomorrow.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Anyway, that's the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop the recording now once I come down here, and hopefully you found this. Hopefully you found this useful on there. Any questions, gents?
For me, it's prompted things that I've forgotten about over the years, like the Udos. I've always sworn by it, not realizing the full reasons why I was doing it. And I always say at the moment, I don't peak. Well, I do. I've got my own strategies to doing it. I think for me, I'm more consistent because I know what works for my own body after doing it for 40 odd years.